Before the Ottoman conquests swept across southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, the Christian convents of Byzantium, the Balkans, and Anatolia existed as quiet islands of spiritual devotion, learning, and community life. To understand the profound shock that later events brought upon these nuns, it is essential to first understand the world they inhabited, its rituals, its rhythms, its hopes, and the fragile protections it relied upon. Far from being isolated prisons, many convents were vibrant sanctuaries that combined intellectual pursuit, economic activity, and deep religious purpose. Their world, however, was far more vulnerable than many realize, and by the time Ottoman armies approached, this vulnerability had become a silent but looming threat. Life inside a Christian convent was structured but meaningful. Nuns lived according to monastic rules that emphasized prayer, contemplation, modesty, and service. Their days followed a steady rhythm shaped by the ringing of bells, dawn prayers, communal meals, scripture reading, work in the gardens or scriptoria, evening hymns, and nights spent in reflection. Each activity was meant to draw them closer to God while building a community where no woman stood alone. Many of these convents had existed for centuries, their foundations laid by Byzantine emperors, local nobles, or wealthy families who viewed them as centers of spiritual protection for their regions. These institutions were also repositories of culture. Within their walls, manuscripts were copied, icons painted, hymns composed, and theological debates preserved. Some convents maintained schools for local girls, others provided food, shelter, and healing to the poor. In certain places, nuns even acted as mediators between feuding families or villages, their status granting them a unique moral authority. Their influence reached far beyond the cloistered gates, and for this reason they were both respected and occasionally politically significant. Yet behind this spiritual serenity lay a fragile reality. Convents depended heavily on the stability of the surrounding political world. Their survival relied on the goodwill of local rulers, the protection of nearby castles, and the peaceful cooperation of surrounding communities. When that political order began to collapse, whether through war, economic hardship, or shifting alliances, the convents became extremely vulnerable. This fragility grew increasingly apparent in the centuries leading up to the Ottoman expansion. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many regions once controlled by Byzantine or Latin Christian powers were fractured by internal conflict. Local lords engaged in constant feuds, peasant revolts erupted periodically, and plagues devastated entire towns. The Byzantine Empire, once the most powerful Christian state of the East, was reduced to a handful of territories clinging to survival. Its ability to protect the religious institutions within its shrinking borders weakened with every passing year. This slow unraveling created a vacuum, one the Ottomans were quick to fill. The nuns inside the convents were not unaware of the growing danger. Word of the Ottoman conquest spread quickly, first as rumors, then as testimonies brought by refugees fleeing captured villages or besieged cities. Travelers arriving at the convent gates described armies that fought with discipline, commanders who negotiated firmly but strategically, and changes in governance that reshaped entire provinces overnight. Some villagers believed the Ottomans would tolerate Christian institutions the way they did in earlier conquests. Others feared the worst. The nuns themselves, though sheltered, could sense the tremors of approaching upheaval. As the Ottoman Empire expanded, many convents found themselves caught between warring states. Some communities attempted to prepare by reinforcing their walls, hiding valuable manuscripts, or sending younger nuns to safer regions. Others placed their hopes in diplomacy, appealing to local nobles or distant rulers for protection. Yet these efforts were often undermined by the sheer pace of Ottoman territorial gains and the political disunity of Christian leaders. In certain regions, the Ottomans' advance was so swift that entire religious communities had only days, or sometimes hours, to decide whether to flee, surrender, or remain in place and pray for mercy. At the same time, the Ottomans operated under a complex system of imperial law and administration. While some Christian institutions were allowed to function, especially in areas that surrendered peacefully, others faced stricter treatment depending on local resistance, strategic needs, or the actions of individual commanders. This inconsistency created an atmosphere of deep uncertainty among convents. Nuns never knew whether they would be spared, taxed, displaced, or forcibly absorbed into a new social order. The unpredictability was, in many ways, more terrifying than any specific threat. The psychological impact on the convent communities was immense. Many nuns had taken vows of lifelong stability, meaning they expected to remain in their convent from the day they entered until their final breath. The convent was not just a home, it was a sacred promise, a spiritual sanctuary, and a place where they believed divine protection would prevail over earthly turmoil. To be forced from such a place, or to watch it stand defenseless before foreign armies, was not simply a political crisis, but a profound spiritual ordeal. Within the walls, discussions grew increasingly urgent. Some elders believed they should stand firm and accept whatever fate God ordained. Others whispered of escape routes, hidden mountain paths, or nearby islands where they might find refuge. Younger nuns, many barely in their teens, looked to their superiors for reassurance, often receiving hopeful but strained words meant to calm their fears. Though united in faith, the community was divided in strategy, and this internal conflict added another layer of tension to an already overwhelming situation. Meanwhile, the economic foundations of many convents were collapsing. Fields were abandoned as peasants fled advancing armies. Trade routes became unsafe, leaving convents without essential supplies. Donations from wealthy families dwindled as noble houses either fell in battle or redirected their resources toward desperate military defenses. Even the simple act of obtaining bread or oil became a weekly struggle. Hunger and uncertainty slowly replaced the once stable rhythms of monastic life. Yet despite the fear, many convents continued their spiritual duties with remarkable resolve. Bells still rang for morning prayers. Hymns still echoed across empty courtyards. Icons were still tended with reverence. For the nuns, these rituals were not mere traditions, they were lifelines, ways to maintain courage when the world outside crumbled. Their faith became both a shield and a burden, offering comfort yet reminding them of the vows they might soon be unable to uphold. This hidden world, peaceful yet precarious, devout yet vulnerable, forms the backdrop to the dramatic events that unfolded when the Ottomans finally reached their convent walls. Understanding this world is essential, for the impact of conquest cannot be fully felt without first seeing what was lost. These convents were more than buildings, they were communities rooted in centuries of history, culture, and spiritual devotion. When that world collided with the expanding Ottoman Empire, the consequences were not merely political, but deeply human, reshaping the lives and legacies of the women who lived within those sacred walls. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the late 14th and early 15th centuries brought a new and formidable power into the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans. As this empire expanded, it did not merely conquer territory, it reshaped entire societies. Christian strongholds, fortified towns, monasteries, and convents, once bastions of culture, faith, and political authority, suddenly found themselves at the crossroads of history. The collision of empires during this period was not only military but deeply social and religious, altering the lives of ordinary people, and particularly women living in secluded religious communities. Christian strongholds were established with careful attention to defense, geography, and strategic alliances. Towns were often built atop hills or surrounded by walls, while monasteries and convents were located near rivers or forests that could provide food, water, and concealment in times of conflict. Many of these strongholds had endured centuries of regional disputes, surviving raids, dynastic wars, and invasions by neighboring powers. Within these walls, communities believed themselves protected by both earthly defenses and divine providence. But the Ottomans, with their highly organized military machine, proved a challenge unlike any the region had previously faced. The Ottoman military system was sophisticated and adaptive. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps, were professional soldiers trained from a young age in loyalty, discipline, and tactics. Ottoman commanders were adept at siege warfare, utilizing both brute force and psychological strategies to compel surrender without unnecessary destruction. They combined cavalry, artillery, and infantry in coordinated attacks that overwhelmed traditional defenses. For Christian strongholds, accustomed to sporadic or fragmented assaults, the Ottoman approach was both efficient and terrifying. Political fragmentation among Christian states made resistance even more difficult. The Byzantine Empire, once a dominant power, had been reduced to a few scattered territories by the late 14th century. Local Balkan principalities often competed among themselves, prioritizing local feuds over collective defense against the advancing Ottomans. Western European powers, though occasionally sending aid or mercenaries, were primarily concerned with their own wars and rarely coordinated effective relief. This lack of unity meant that strongholds frequently had to face Ottoman armies alone, with minimal external support. As Ottoman forces approached, the atmosphere within these fortresses changed dramatically. Villagers sought refuge behind thick walls, merchants abandoned shops, and convents became temporary shelters for displaced families. Communication with the outside world became sporadic, rumors ran rampant, and fear permeated daily life. The nuns, who had previously lived a life of spiritual focus, were suddenly confronted with a world dominated by uncertainty and danger. Their convents, once sanctuaries, became fortresses in both a literal and figurative sense. Sieges were not merely physical confrontations, they were psychological battles designed to weaken morale. Ottoman commanders often sent envoys to towns and convents, offering terms of surrender or protection in exchange for allegiance and tribute. Refusal meant prolonged siege, starvation, or assault. For convents that had never engaged in politics or negotiation, these interactions were unprecedented. Nuns who had devoted themselves entirely to prayer now had to navigate threats that required diplomacy, courage, and quick thinking. Every decision carried life or death consequences. Even when surrender was negotiated, the consequences were profound. Christian leaders who capitulated were sometimes allowed to maintain limited autonomy, but their populations, particularly women and children, were at risk of displacement, forced labor, or conscription. Convents that surrendered peacefully were not guaranteed safety. Local Ottoman officials interpreted imperial policies according to circumstance, sometimes sparing religious communities and sometimes imposing harsh restrictions. This unpredictability heightened fear and made each encounter with Ottoman forces deeply stressful. The fall of major Christian cities amplified the sense of inevitability. Cities such as Thessalonica and Constantinople had resisted for decades, investing enormous resources in fortifications and military preparations. Yet when Ottoman forces eventually breached these defenses, the consequences reverberated across the region. News of captured cities traveled quickly, serving as both a warning and a psychological weapon. Convents which may have once assumed their walls were sufficient protection now faced the stark reality that no fortress could guarantee safety against a determined and well-equipped army. Beyond military conquest, the collision of empires involved cultural and administrative restructuring. The Ottomans implemented a system of governance that allowed for some religious autonomy under the millet system, but this came with taxation, legal oversight, and social hierarchy that subordinated Christian institutions to the state. Convents, monasteries, and churches that survived physically were often subjected to new rules governing their finances, property rights, and daily operations. For nuns who'd once lived in self-contained spiritual communities, adapting to this new order was both confusing and humiliating. Their autonomy, sacred as it had seemed, was now contingent upon Ottoman authority. The human cost of these conquests extended beyond politics and administration. Refugees flooded into surviving strongholds, bringing disease, hunger, and trauma. Families were separated, young men were recruited or captured, and nuns often faced the additional burden of protecting the vulnerable, children, the elderly, and those unable to flee. Convents became not just religious centers, but emergency shelters and makeshift hospitals. The spiritual duties of the nuns were intertwined with practical responsibilities that challenged every aspect of their lives. Their ability to continue religious observance in the midst of displacement and fear was constantly tested. For nuns, witnessing the collapse of Christian strongholds was emotionally devastating. These women had grown up hearing stories of saints, holy leaders, and miraculous defenses of their cities. Now they saw firsthand that human institutions, even those fortified by faith, could be toppled by superior forces. The spiritual and psychological impact was profound. Many recorded these experiences in letters, diaries, or oral accounts, emphasizing the dual reality of fear and resilience. Their narratives often reflected the tension between hope in divine protection and the stark reality of political defeat. The fall of Christian strongholds also reshaped regional identity and collective memory. Communities that had survived centuries of conflict suddenly found themselves living under foreign rule, forced to navigate a society with different legal, social, and religious expectations. The memory of lost fortresses and displaced populations became embedded in folklore, religious commemorations, and cultural practices. For convents, preserving these memories was part of their spiritual mission, linking past generations with the present and reinforcing the continuity of faith despite political upheaval. Ultimately, the collision of empires was not merely a military event, it was a transformation of social, religious, and cultural life. Christian strongholds that had once symbolized security, learning, and spiritual devotion became sites of vulnerability, testing the endurance and adaptability of those who lived within them. Nuns, in particular, faced challenges that were unprecedented, negotiating survival, maintaining religious practice, and providing care for the displaced and traumatized. Their experiences illustrate the human dimensions of conquest, showing that the impact of empire extended far beyond battlefields and political treaties. Understanding this context is essential for comprehending the later experiences of Christian nuns under Ottoman expansion. The fall of strongholds set the stage for captivity, displacement, and forced adaptation, creating circumstances in which spiritual devotion intersected with profound physical and psychological hardship. In this collision of empires, the nuns' hidden world of prayer and contemplation collided with the unyielding advance of a formidable new power, marking the beginning of one of history's most challenging periods for Christian religious communities in the region. By the time Ottoman forces approached, the once peaceful world of Christian convents had been transformed into a tense and precarious environment. The walls had once offered sanctuary now became sites of uncertainty as the nuns faced dilemmas they were neither trained nor psychologically prepared to confront. Convents were traditionally insulated from the political and military conflicts of the outside world. Their daily lives revolved around prayer, contemplation, and communal duties. Yet, in the shadow of an advancing empire, every routine was overshadowed by fear, every sacred space threatened by the prospect of intrusion. The inner life of the convent became a crucible where faith, strategy, and survival collided. Fear within the convents was palpable and multifaceted. On one level, it was the fear of physical harm, rumors of massacres, forced displacement, and the capture of communities circulated rapidly, often amplified by travelers or refugees fleeing nearby towns. On another level, fear was existential. For nuns who had dedicated their lives to God within the confines of the convent walls, the possibility of losing their home was also a spiritual crisis. Their sanctuary was more than a building, it was a symbol of their lifelong commitment, a sacred space consecrated to devotion and study. The thought of leaving it, or worse, having it violated, was deeply unsettling. This pervasive fear influenced daily routines. Morning prayers and evening vigils took on an added intensity, with nuns seeking solace and guidance in scripture and ritual. Meals, usually a time of communal fellowship, were often eaten in silence, as each woman contemplated the potential outcomes of the approaching threat. Even tasks like tending the gardens or maintaining the convent library became exercises in vigilance. Windows were watched more closely, gates double-checked, and valuable items hidden away. The convent was no longer a purely spiritual haven. It was a potential target, and every member of the community felt the weight of responsibility for its protection. Flight became a consideration for many convents, though it was never a simple choice. Geography often dictated options. Convents located near rivers, mountains, or forests had potential escape routes, but these were perilous. The roads were fraught with danger, from bandits to Ottoman patrols, and leaving meant abandoning sacred spaces that had housed generations of nuns. Furthermore, many convents housed elderly or infirm members who could not travel easily, making the logistics of flight a complex moral and practical dilemma. Decisions about whether to flee required careful deliberation, weighing the risks of remaining against the uncertainties of escape. In some cases, convents attempted to coordinate with local authorities or neighboring communities to arrange temporary refuge. Monastic networks often extended over large regions, and messages could be sent to sister convents to prepare safe havens. Young women might be hidden with families sympathetic to the church, while the older nuns attempted to negotiate safe passage or maintain a semblance of normalcy. However, communication was slow and unreliable. By the time plans were made, Ottoman forces might already be at the convent gates, leaving little choice but to confront the situation head-on. When flight was impossible or deemed too risky, the focus shifted to negotiation and surrender. This was a terrifying and unfamiliar role for nuns, whose lives had previously been entirely separated from political dealings. Negotiations often involved offering tribute, promising obedience, or surrendering valuables in exchange for protection. The Ottomans, pragmatic in approach, sometimes honored these agreements, allowing the convents to continue their religious practices under supervision. Other times, promises of safety were disregarded, depending on local commanders' interpretations. The convents perceived resistance, or the strategic importance of the location. The unpredictability of these outcomes added to the psychological strain on the communities. The process of surrender was itself fraught with anxiety. Convents were often required to open gates, meet with Ottoman officials, and present a representative capable of speaking on behalf of the community. This representative, often the abbess or senior nun, carried an enormous burden, the responsibility for the lives of everyone in the convent, as well as the moral weight of negotiating survival in a hostile environment. These encounters were highly stressful and could determine whether the convent retained its integrity or suffered displacement, loss of property, or worse. Every word and gesture mattered, and the stakes could not have been higher. Even when surrender agreements were reached, the impact on convent life was immediate and profound. Certain rights were curtailed, access to external communities might be restricted, donations could be limited, and religious practices subjected to oversight. The convents were still sacred spaces, but their autonomy was compromised. Nuns had to adapt to a new hierarchy imposed from the outside, balancing obedience to Ottoman authorities with their spiritual duties. This delicate negotiation between survival and devotion created daily tension as nuns worked to maintain both their faith and the physical integrity of their communities. The psychological toll of forced surrender extended beyond the immediate circumstances. Nuns experienced grief for their lost autonomy, anxiety over the uncertain future, and guilt for those who were displaced or harmed during the process. Diaries, letters, and oral histories from the period often describe a pervasive sense of vulnerability combined with steadfast faith. Some nuns interpreted these hardships as a divine test, finding comfort in spiritual devotion even as they faced profound worldly challenges. Others struggled with despair, questioning why their sacred lives had been subjected to such peril. In some regions, convents that surrendered peacefully were allowed to remain largely intact, serving as symbols of resilience and continuity. These communities often became centers of support for others who had been displaced or affected by the conflict. Nuns provided shelter to refugees, distributed food, and maintained education for local children. In this sense, the convents remained active agents in their communities, even under Ottoman oversight. Their ability to adapt while preserving core spiritual practices exemplifies a remarkable resilience in the face of overwhelming external pressure. However, not all convents were fortunate. Some experienced direct attacks, looting, or destruction. In such cases, the psychological and material losses were devastating. Sacred objects, manuscripts, and centuries of accumulated culture could be destroyed in a single event. The nuns, once custodians of religious tradition and community life, were suddenly stripped of their physical and social foundations. For survivors, the trauma of witnessing such events often left lasting scars, influencing both personal spirituality and collective memory for generations. Despite the fear, flight, and forced surrenders, many convent communities demonstrated extraordinary resilience. The bonds between nuns, forged over years of shared devotion, became a source of strength. Spiritual routines, prayers, chanting, meditation were maintained wherever possible, even in temporary shelters or under supervision. These practices provided psychological stability and a sense of continuity amid upheaval, reinforcing the identity of the convent as a sacred space, even when its physical integrity was compromised. The nuns' ability to balance survival with devotion illustrates both human adaptability and the enduring power of faith. In retrospect, the experiences inside the convents highlight the intersection of spirituality, politics, and survival. Nuns were thrust into a world they had previously been shielded from, where decisions carried life or death consequences, and where faith alone could not guarantee safety. The period of Ottoman expansion forced these religious women to navigate fear, execute strategic choices, and endure profound uncertainty, all while maintaining the spiritual and communal responsibilities that defined their lives. Understanding this internal struggle is essential to appreciating the broader consequences of conquest and the resilience of religious communities in the face of existential threats. Ultimately, the story of fear, flight, and forced surrender within the convents is a testament to both human vulnerability and endurance. The nuns' experiences provide insight into the complex realities of life under the shadow of empire, where sacred spaces became sites of negotiation, courage, and adaptation. They remind us that historical events are not only shaped by armies and politics, but also by the lived experiences of ordinary people. Women who, despite isolation and spiritual devotion, faced challenges that tested the very core of their faith and humanity. The stories of Christian nuns during the Ottoman conquests are not just tales of displacement or negotiation, they are testimonies of captivity, hardship, and resilience. While convents had long been sanctuaries of faith, scholarship, and community, the advance of Ottoman forces introduced circumstances that tested both their physical endurance and spiritual devotion. Captivity, in its many forms, became a harsh reality for these women. It encompassed forced relocation, labor, enforced submission to unfamiliar social structures, and exposure to profound uncertainty. To understand the experiences of these nuns, it is crucial to examine both the historical context and the personal accounts that illuminate their lives during this turbulent period. Captivity often began with surrender or the fall of nearby fortresses. Nuns who had previously lived in protected spaces found themselves removed from their convents and transported to distant territories. The routes of relocation were perilous, involving long marches through unfamiliar landscapes, exposure to harsh weather, and the constant threat of attack or robbery. While some Ottoman administrators treated surrendered religious communities with relative restraint, others viewed them as spoils of conquest, offering little consideration for their welfare. These journeys were not merely physical challenges, they were psychological trials, forcing nuns to confront uncertainty, loss, and the sudden upheaval of everything they had known. Historical records, letters, and chronicles from the period provide glimpses into the complex realities of captivity. Nuns often described a world that was simultaneously alien and oppressive. Daily routines, once centered on prayer and communal work, were disrupted by forced labor, relocation tasks, or constant movement between settlements. The physical strain of these activities was compounded by emotional and spiritual stress. Many nuns clung to prayer and ritual as anchors of stability, attempting to maintain a sense of identity amid conditions designed to undermine it. Their spiritual devotion became both a source of strength and a coping mechanism in circumstances that could otherwise seem overwhelming. The experience of captivity was also deeply social. Nuns, accustomed to a tightly knit communal life within the convent, had to navigate entirely new social hierarchies under Ottoman oversight. Leaders of the religious community, often abbesses, were expected to represent their groups, negotiate provisions, and maintain order. These responsibilities were fraught with difficulty. A single misstep could endanger the entire community, yet maintaining discipline and morale was crucial for survival. The dynamics of captivity demanded resourcefulness, diplomacy, and emotional resilience, qualities that were often tested to their limits. Forced adaptation extended to everyday life. Convents were frequently stripped of material resources, including manuscripts, icons, and food stores. Nuns had to find ways to preserve their faith and community despite these losses. Improvised living arrangements often replaced familiar convent cells. Communal prayers and religious observances were held in temporary structures or open spaces, where environmental conditions and the presence of unfamiliar authorities complicated spiritual practice. Maintaining a sense of sacred space in captivity was a subtle but powerful act of resistance, affirming identity and faith even when traditional structures had been disrupted. The psychological impact of captivity was profound. Nuns faced isolation, uncertainty, and the constant reminder of vulnerability. Letters from survivors frequently describe fear, anxiety, and grief, intertwined with moments of courage, hope, and spiritual reflection. The trauma of being uprooted from one's home, witnessing the fall of nearby communities, and enduring harsh treatment left long-lasting effects. Memory and oral tradition became tools for processing these experiences as nuns recorded their stories for posterity, ensuring that future generations would remember both their suffering and resilience. Historical accounts also reveal the spectrum of treatment faced by nuns in captivity. Some were relocated to other convents or religious institutio, under Ottoman oversight, where they could continue certain spiritual practices but under new authority and surveillance. Others were compelled to serve in roles that diverged from their traditional religious duties, including household work, administration, or other labor demanded by local officials. While the specifics varied widely depending on location, commanders, and circumstances, the common thread was a loss of autonomy and the need to navigate a world in which their sacred status no longer guaranteed safety or respect. Captivity had social and cultural dimensions as well. Nuns were suddenly part of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire with its own laws, customs, and hierarchies. The Ottoman administration allowed a degree of religious tolerance, but this was conditional on compliance with state authority, taxes, and regulations. For nuns, who had lived in relative isolation, these requirements could be bewildering and stressful. The cultural shift necessitated adaptation, learning to interact with officials, negotiate for provisions, and understand new social norms, all while preserving internal cohesion and spiritual identity. One of the most striking aspects of captivity was the resilience displayed by these women. Despite profound challenges, many convents maintained religious observance, supported one another emotionally, and found ways to continue education and charitable work. In some cases, nuns became centers of aid for displaced Christian populations, offering shelter and care to those who had fled violence or oppression. These acts of service demonstrated both the continuity of spiritual mission and the adaptability of religious communities under duress. Captivity also shaped the collective memory and identity of Christian communities. The narratives preserved by nuns contributed to broader historical understanding of Ottoman expansion and its impact on religious institutions. They highlighted not only suffering but also the ways in which faith, solidarity, and intelligence enabled communities to endure. These stories were transmitted orally, written in chronicles, or embedded in later religious commemorations, ensuring that the experiences of captivity were neither forgotten nor erased from collective memory. The experiences of these nuns remind us that captivity was not a uniform phenomenon. It varied depending on location, timing, and Ottoman administration. Some convents experienced shorter periods of oversight, while others endured extended displacement. Some leaders negotiated favorable conditions, while others faced harsher treatment. Yet across these differences, common themes emerge: disruption of sacred life, loss of autonomy, psychological strain, and the ongoing effort to maintain spiritual identity. Captivity, in essence, became both a challenge to survival and an arena in which nuns demonstrated remarkable courage and resilience. In conclusion, the accounts of captivity faced by Christian nuns during the Ottoman expansion reveal a complex interplay of vulnerability, adaptation, and endurance. These women, once protected within convent walls, were thrust into a world dominated by unfamiliar authority, social upheaval, and physical hardship. Their responses, ranging from steadfast spiritual devotion to pragmatic negotiation, illustrate the multifaceted reality of life under occupation. Captivity was more than a historical fact. It was an experience that tested faith, intellect, and courage. By studying these narratives, we gain insight into the human dimensions of empire, the resilience of religious communities, and the enduring impact of history on collective memory. The experiences of Christian nuns during the Ottoman expansions left deep and lasting imprints, not only on the individuals who endured captivity, forced relocation, and the collapse of their convent communities, but also on the broader cultural and religious memory of the regions affected. While much of the historical record focuses on military campaigns, territorial gains, or political administration, the true human cost is most vividly captured in the stories preserved by survivors themselves. These narratives, through letters, chronicles, oral accounts, and later hagiographies, served as both testimony and mechanism for coping with the trauma endured. They ensured that the hardships, resilience, and spiritual courage of nuns were not forgotten, even as their convents were dismantled or repurposed. The trauma experienced by these women was multi-layered. On a physical level, nuns endured hunger, displacement, and the threat of violence. Their convents, previously spaces of stability and sanctity, were often reduced to ruins or transformed into secular or military spaces. Spiritually, these women faced the profound challenge of maintaining faith amid chaos. The sacred routines that once structured their lives, prayers, liturgies, communal worship, were disrupted or made impossible, leaving a void that tested the very core of their devotion. Psychologically, fear, uncertainty, and grief became constants, compounded by the observation of wider suffering within their communities. These intertwined experiences of physical, spiritual, and psychological strain constitute what modern scholars might describe as historical trauma, a collective burden whose effects reverberated for generations. Survivors often sought to preserve their experiences as a form of both resistance and continuity. Writing, whether in formal chronicles, private diaries, or letters to family and fellow nuns, became a tool for documenting the realities of conquest. These documents served multiple purposes. They recorded the facts of captivity and survival, maintained the lineage and identity of the convent, and offered a moral framework for understanding suffering in a religious context. Through narrative, survivors transformed personal and communal trauma into a form of testimony, preserving their perspective for posterity. These stories emphasize not only loss and suffering, but also courage, adaptability, and the ongoing commitment to spiritual ideals despite the collapse of familiar structures. Oral traditions played an equally vital role in the preservation of trauma. In many cases, younger generations of nuns were taught the experiences of their elders through storytelling, hymns, and communal remembrance. Oral transmission allowed memories to be passed down even when written documents were destroyed or inaccessible. Storytelling became an act of collective identity building, ensuring that the lessons of endurance and faith remained alive within the community. Rituals, feast days, and liturgical commemorations were also adapted to reflect the historical experience of survival and suffering, embedding memory within spiritual practice. This dual preservation, through both word and ritual, helped maintain continuity of tradition in the face of political and social upheaval. The psychological function of preserving stories should not be underestimated. For survivors, articulating their experiences provided a means of processing trauma. Writing or speaking about fear, displacement, and suffering allowed nuns to transform passive suffering into active reflection. It offered a sense of agency, enabling them to assert control over the narrative of their lives when so many external forces had stripped them of autonomy. Preservation of memory became an act of empowerment. It was a declaration that, despite loss and oppression, their experiences, faith, and identity remained intact and meaningful. Preservation of stories also had broader cultural and political implications. The accounts of surviving nuns served as historical evidence for the wider Christian communities of Europe, reinforcing perceptions of Ottoman conquest and informing diplomatic, religious, and scholarly responses. Chronicles describing captivity, forced relocation, and loss of convent property contributed to debates over regional alliances, support for refugee populations, and the protection of Christian institutions under Ottoman rule. By documenting their experiences, nuns inadvertently shaped the historical record, ensuring that the consequences of conquest were recognized beyond their immediate communities. Another significant aspect of preserving stories was the moral and theological framing applied by survivors. Many accounts interpreted suffering through the lens of faith, presenting trauma as a test of devotion, an opportunity for spiritual purification, or a demonstration of divine will. This framing allowed survivors to make sense of experiences that were otherwise incomprehensible and offered consolation to those facing similar hardships. It also reinforced communal bonds. By sharing narratives that emphasized endurance and faith, survivors cultivated a collective identity grounded in resilience and spiritual continuity, rather than defeat or despair. The transmission of these stories across generations also influenced the preservation of cultural memory. Descendants of affected communities, whether through monastic lineages, families connected to convents or local populations, maintained knowledge of the experiences of nuns under Ottoman conquest. These memories were often integrated into local folklore, liturgical commemorations, and historical scholarship. Even as political regimes changed, as monasteries were rebuilt or abandoned, and as communities relocated, the narratives of survival and trauma remained embedded in cultural consciousness. They provided a bridge between the immediate experience of historical events and the ongoing interpretation of regional history. In some cases, these stories became foundational texts for understanding broader social and religious dynamics under Ottoman rule. Scholars have noted that nuns' accounts provide invaluable insight into the interplay of gender, power, and religion in early modern Southeast Europe. Through their narratives, historians can examine not only the direct impact of conquest on religious institutions, but also the strategies of survival, negotiation, and adaptation employed by women in constrained circumstances. The testimonies of nuns offer a unique perspective, highlighting experiences often overlooked in military or political chronicles dominated by male actors. In this sense, the preservation of their stories contributes not only to historical memory, but also to the study of gendered experiences in times of crisis. The legacy of trauma also had enduring psychological and social consequences. Communities shaped by these experiences often carried collective memories of displacement, loss, and resilience that influenced social structures, communal identity, and religious practice for centuries. Stories of survival reinforced communal solidarity, providing a shared narrative of endurance that strengthened cohesion among dispersed or challenged Christian populations. At the same time, these narratives also transmitted cautionary lessons, teaching future generations about vulnerability, vigilance, and the necessity of adaptation in times of political upheaval. Finally, the preservation of these stories represents a profound testament to human resilience and the capacity to find meaning amid suffering. Nuns who survived captivity, forced relocation, and the loss of their convents did more than endure. They documented, reflected upon, and transmitted their experiences, ensuring that future generations could learn from both their hardships and their courage. Their narratives remind us that history is not only shaped by armies, empires, and political treaties, but also by the lived experiences of ordinary individuals whose resilience and faith sustain communities through times of extraordinary adversity. In conclusion, the legacy of trauma among Christian nuns during the Ottoman expansions illustrates the enduring power of memory, storytelling, and faith. Survivors preserved their experiences through written, oral, and ritual forms, creating a rich repository of historical and cultural knowledge. These narratives provided mechanisms for coping, frameworks for understanding suffering, and means of maintaining communal and spiritual identity. By preserving their stories, nuns ensured that their struggles, courage, and devotion were neither erased nor forgotten, leaving a lasting imprint on both history and collective memory. Their testimonies stand as enduring evidence of the human capacity to endure, adapt, and find meaning, even in the most challenging circumstances.